All right, welcome to our fourth session today. We are aware that some of you on Thursday are trying to catch a 12:50 flight to to Chicago from Salt Lake. You should actually be fine, but we're going to shorten the break on Thursday by 15 minutes so that those of you that are leaving for that flight should have no trouble getting it. It's a 45 to 50 minute drive to the airport. That time of day, it should be no traffic. It should be not a problem. But we will take a shortened break on Thursday just to make people feel at ease about that. If you do have a flight that is before 1 o'clock, if you'll just let Teresa know, we'll make a list of folks that are trying to get out of here immediately at the close of the summit, and we'll help you coordinate transportation. I don't know what that is.
This evening, some of you, as you know, we're in here at 4:30. At 5:30, there's a bus that will take us to the Olympic Park where we'll have dinner and a show. Some of you who are staying in the Silver Baron may want to go back to your hotel at 4:30. The University of Utah faculty have generously volunteered to drive you down there. And then there will be a bus that stops at the Silver Baron and picks you up. So you don't have to come back up here. We'll just pick you up there. And so Bill Hesterly, wave your hand, Bill. I got you on the list, Bill. You have 4 passengers. Lyda Bigelow is down here. Rob Webker. Rob is there. And Bill Schultz. So between those people, we should be able to get you down there without any problem. So just meet downstairs in front of the lobby, and if you need to ride down to the Silver Baron, and you just stay down there to pick up the bus.
Great. Just a quick word of introduction for this last session. Sometimes I read in our literature about Knightian and uncertainty, and I think that what they're actually saying is that in a world of Knightian uncertainty, we should shut the field of strategy down. And so we've given that question to this panel. What do we do with Knightian uncertainty, and how do we navigate that in strategic management?
All right. First of all, thanks to Jay and Todd for inviting me to put this panel together on one of the most interesting, one of the most relevant, and probably also one of the most difficult concepts in all of social science, namely that of Knightian uncertainty. One of the reasons why this is difficult and perplexing is that we do use the concept, but there's extremely little agreement on what exactly it is. And many of us, to be entirely honest, may not really know what we mean when we toss that concept around. But luckily, to help clear up some of the confusion today, we have 3 scholars who have worked on Knightian uncertainty and will present their different takes on the concept and its potential usefulness in the field of strategy, namely, and we'll go in that order, Michael Leiblein, Alfonso Gambardella, and Violina Rendova. And I'll briefly introduce some of the key subjects that we're going to touch upon in this panel. So when we use the word of Knightian uncertainty, of course we make reference to the work of this person. This is Frank Knight, wearing his professorial gear in his office at the University of Chicago, where he was a professor of economics for several decades. Knight today is probably best remembered for his distinction between risk and uncertainty, developed at great length in his doctoral dissertation, which was reworked and published in 1921 under the title of Risk, Uncertainty, and profit. And as you can see from that number over there, it's a generously cited piece that it's fair to call it a social science classic. Also a classic in the sense that it's cited a lot, but it's probably not read a lot. So many of those who invoke the distinction between risk and uncertainty may not know that the distinction is embedded in basically a philosophical argument. So this is fundamentally a quasi-philosophical treatise. So Knight spends considerable space talking about, how the world is indeterminate, and for that reason the future is unknowable, and therefore as decision makers, including strategic decision makers and entrepreneurs, we have a problem. Luckily, though, evolution has furnished us with a mental apparatus that help us cope with this indeterminacy, because we can put events of the same kind into classes or categories, and of course that forms the basis for the formation of probability estimates, which then help us guide our decision making. Except, Knight says, and for those cases in which we're dealing with events that are truly unique in the sense that we cannot put them into a category or a class. And in that case, Knight basically says, science cannot help us at all. I mean, we are left to our own devices, which is about, forming an image of the future. Today we'd call it a representation or a theory, I suppose. We base our actions on this image, and we try to exercise judgment as well as we can. Judgment in the sense of decision-making when, in those situations, when there is not a rule for decision-making or a model that can guide decision-making. But we can still act, although Knight says this is nothing that science can truly tell us much about. These more philosophical aspects of Knight and the risk-uncertainty distinction will be covered to a large extent in Violina's talk today. And next issue, why care about Knightian uncertainty? Well, here are three basic reasons. The first one is that Knightian uncertainty is just important to a lot of real-world decision-making, particularly decision-making that is about major, irreversible decisions involving interdependencies, decisions that have a huge element of novelty, and so on. And of course, the arguments around that this kind of decision-making have become increasingly important given increasing turbulence and whatnot. The second reason has to do with, our traditional dependent variables in strategy research, namely outlier returns. I should be careful here because obviously this is just one of the many dependent variables that we're interested in, although a major one. But arguably, Knightian uncertainty gives us additional insight into outlier returns. And a third reason to care about Knightian uncertainty is, well, as already indicated, it is closely related to, complementary even perhaps, to notions of theories, representations, and judgment that have gained prominence in recent strategy thinking. There are probably more reasons, but these are three obvious ones. What then is Knightian uncertainty? And there's a lot of diversity. So there's an argument which has been around almost from the year that Knight's treatise was published, that this, what Knight is really talking about when talking about uncertainty is subjective probability. So you could interpret Frank Ramsey's work, for example, in that vein. And I had a discussion with Eric van Steen yesterday, and he said, well, Knight fundamentally is just about differing priors. And I had to sympathize because, having made that argument myself, it is true. A lot of what Knight says about uncertainty and what he makes with uncertainty can be interpreted in this Bayesian manner. But as Eric told me just an hour ago, yeah, perhaps there actually is more to Knight than just differing priors. And I think that is the case. So a different interpretation of Knight is that, this is about ambiguity. And this is the currently dominant interpretation of Knightian uncertainty. And this is the interpretation that you're going to find in finance, in economics, and in decision theory. Then there are also folks who will associate Knightian uncertainty with the notion of unforeseen contingencies. And there are perhaps an argument to be made that we can think of the recent literature on unawareness and ignorance as one interpretation of what Knightian uncertainty is. And then there's a final interpretation, which I surmise is the one that is closest to perhaps what Knight really meant, namely that when talking about uncertainty, what we really mean is that decision makers do not confront a given decision space. Rather, it's the state space. The state space is being created by the creative choices of entrepreneurs and strategists. And the different interpretations of Knightian uncertainty will pop up in at least two of the talks today, namely Michael's in particular, I suppose, but also in Alfonso's talk. All right, what has been done so far in the Knightian uncertainty domain? So with some colleagues, I recently performed a literature review, and we identified more than 700 articles about Knightian uncertainty in the various journals. So contrary to what some people believe or say, this isn't a small literature. It's relatively big, and it spans multiple disciplines: economics, finance, decision theory, even sociology, and of course, management. But it's, again, it is a literature that is strongly heterogeneous in terms of analytical style and in the way in which the arguments are being presented. What we also noticed when we did the review is that there are actually very few strategy papers that explicitly invoke and do things with the notion of Knightian uncertainty. We identified about 20 articles, most of them published in the Academy of Management Review, which has become the Knightian uncertainty go-to journal. Not the SMJ, but the AMR, probably prompted by the special issue on Knightian uncertainty that was published back in, I believe, was it 2020. Most of these articles, with a few exceptions, such as Violina's article, don't deal with Knightian uncertainty in great detail. Don't discuss what we may really mean by it. They're interested in the consequences of Knightian uncertainty. So it's like a Forrest Gump approach to Knightian uncertainty. Knightian uncertainty is what Knightian uncertainty does, right? That's what we're interested in. Final issue I want to briefly touch on is actually the panel, the question that was posed to the panel: how is strategic management useful in a world of Knightian uncertainty? And obviously that question, which was given to us by Jay and Todd, presupposes that, well, we can meaningfully talk about something called Knightian uncertainty and even perhaps agree on it. And furthermore, that this is at least partly descriptive of the world, whatever that exactly means. But to focus that a little bit, consider this hopefully well-known example. Famous entrepreneur, strategist, innovator, inventor, very much acting under conditions of Knightian uncertainty. So, of course, this is Thomas Edison with a light bulb, right? Edison's real innovation, if you like, wasn't the light bulb per se, but rather the commercial exploitation of that invention in the form of the first electric lighting ecosystem, which was launched in New York City in 1878. Edison's newest marvel, according to the newspapers of the time, right? And here's a little thought experiment. Imagine yourself traveling back to 1878, offering advice to Edison. What would you tell him? I believe that there's a lot you could tell Edison when implementing his electric lighting ecosystem in New York City in 1878. And here's just a few ideas. So Alfonso could talk to Edison about the experimentation and how to best conduct the experimentation that Edison engaged in systematically. And perhaps, there may be ways to improve that experimentation. Edison built a very comprehensive theory, very quickly, by the way, of an ecosystem. So the theory-based you could also, perhaps assist his decision-making. And in setting up the ecosystem, he engaged in what some folks would call cognitive leadership in order to get everyone, or relevant complementers, suppliers, and so on board and participating in the new emerging ecosystem. And so on. So the bottom line here, the import of the example is that Knightian uncertainty doesn't remove the foundations of strategy per se. There's a lot we can tell strategists, even under conditions of Knightian uncertainty. But we still have problems. because Edison, when thinking about the theory for his new electric lightning ecosystem and setting it up, confronted uncertainty that could only partially be remedied by experimentation. The true decisive experiment was, of course, the actual launching of the electric lightning ecosystem in New York City in 1878, right? So there is a sense in which Edison confronted what some decision theorists have called non-empirical uncertainty. Uncertainty that couldn't be done away with by experimentation. He built a theory of value creation in a world of Knightian uncertainty. It was a good theory. Was it a superior theory? What actually do we mean? What can we say from an ex-ante perspective, if you like, about what is a good theory, what is perhaps even a superior theory in a world of Knightian uncertainty? And in forming that theory, Edison made an abductive leap from very few data points that were available to his decision-making to that ambitious theory that actually succeeded, and of course was imitated quickly and so on. So strategy can tell us a lot about decision-making, even in a world of Knightian uncertainty, but there are some core thorny issues left. And I think those thorny remaining issues are perhaps addressed most directly in Alfonso's talk. So let's move to our three presenters, with Michael going first.
Well, thank you. Well, I will do the obligatory thanks to Jay and Todd. If you've talked to me over the last several years, I've been curious where the field is going, so I am deeply interested in this week just to see where we might be going. And also thanks to Nikolai. I think, in particular, I want to approach my talk very humbly. I know there's people in this room and probably people outside this room who know a lot more about Knightian uncertainty than I do. But I have been working a little bit about different forms of uncertainty and combinations of uncertainty with Hart and John Chen, more recently with Mike Lennox and Jackson Nickerson. So I'm hoping to bring together some ideas about how we might think about combinations of these definitions of uncertainty, or what I'll call unknowingness, maybe confront some of the problems with the variety of definitions of uncertainty and unknowingness in our field. And then link that with some other work, some with Jeff and Todd on, how are we thinking about what's defining or what's distinctive, or about strategic management, or Mike, I paid attention to your phrasing earlier. We probably should be thinking, why do we have a field, right? So to aggregate knowledge, to direct experimentation, maybe some legitimacy as well. But I think, thanks to Nikolai, sincerely, for helping me think about how I'm going to maybe link these two ideas about strategy, what is strategy and what is uncertainty or Knightian uncertainty or otherwise. And then finally, I have the image of my friend David Ross and his doctoral student Jared Humphrey. There's a sort of sister paper that's on the website. We've been talking about novelty and various notions of uncertainty, and I figured it was worthwhile to acknowledge them and their contribution to these comments. So I started with this, this slide. This is going to be my 3 points that I hope to raise in my discussion. When I looked at the question, I modified it just a little bit. But I think everyone, my prior would be 90% of us would think we'd have to define what strategic management is and Knightian uncertainty is to address this question. And then I wonder how many of us would agree on what strategic management as a field is, and how many of us would agree on what do we mean by uncertainty. And so how do we make progress with all this ambiguity? What I'll do is talk a little bit briefly about my confusion. That's one of the reasons I revealed my ignorance. I'm trying to listen and hear how people think about this notion of, I'll call it unknowingness. One of the books I read in preparation for today was this a book published by Richard Arend earlier this year. He lists 32 different labels that I thought were, at least 24 of them were reasonable variability, to describe the concept of unknowingness that I could see in our literature. So what do we mean by these various notions of unknowingness, and how do I put them together in a way that's meaningful? And again, some of this comes back to some constraints. So I'm seeing notions of, do we mean Knightian uncertainty is a discrete thing, something like I can't write a probability distribution, therefore the uncertainty is Knightian? Or is it a continuous measure, where there is some notion of a range of unknowingness regarding, let's say, imagine a series of integrals of probability distributions of different ranges, and this notion of Ellsbergian ambiguity that Nikolai was talking about. How do I think about that relative to risk? So I think Violina and I have our shared friend Hugh Courtney, and Hugh's 2001 article talks about, like most folks do, a single-dimensional conception of a range of knowingness from certain to risk to uncertain. And I think when he's thinking about Knightian uncertainty in that type of setting, it reminds me of almost a mathematical notion of, think of a number line with extremes of 0 and infinity, and we have to think differently about 0 and infinity. Is that what we mean by Knightian uncertainty? I will say no, but I'll try to think about it as a continuous notion, and then echoing some of the progress maybe Hart and John and I have made. Start thinking about how I would juxtapose that notion of Knightian uncertainty in terms of ambiguity vis-a-vis risk, something we can specify probability distributions for, and how that's going to affect the decision-making approaches we take. So that's going to lead me to my second bullet of, what do we think about what is strategy or strategic management? What tools are relevant for the field? What's unique about the field's questions? What's the purpose of the field? So the sort of my confusion is what I'm trying to raise, in the hope of what I think the purpose of this conference is to generate some debate over cocktail hours and maybe make some progress and be more clear about what we mean by all of our definitions. The second passage, or the second part of my talk, will be about these just claims. I won't be any bolder than saying I'm going to make a couple of claims. The first is I've already alluded to. I'm going to show you a diagram and say, can we think about riskiness or degrees of variation and juxtapose that against something like Knightian uncertainty, this notion of ambiguity, and what does that mean for the utility of some of the decision tools we might be using? And and hopefully I'll make another sort of distinction between what is a decision-making tool and what is a strategic decision-making tool. So there's folks in decision science who's done great things. What's unique about what we're doing as a field of strategic management? Is it just simply aggregation? Are there other things or other tools or other approaches? Maybe it's a system-level approach where there's greater levels of interdependencies. But what is it that's going to make one tool strategic and another less strategic? Why? So I hope the strategic strategic adjective, is meaningful. And so then I'll close with a very pragmatic, simple set of research agendas. If you take my claim that we can start thinking about riskiness and Knightian uncertainty, ambiguity on these two dimensions that I'll show you in a few minutes, well, that, I think, opens up all sorts of interesting questions about which of these areas on this, which of these regimes, these areas in this space are likely to have different performance outcomes, which are likely to have, are there different tools or approaches we could use that are maybe more strategic or not strategic, or if I reference the Pankaj's 2002-2016 article and Martin's book on Your Strategy Needs a Strategy, we already have lists of 84 original approaches, adding in some of Richard Pascal's work, 104 different strategic tools. I mean, we could do some things to sort of start very simply, maybe start thinking about which approaches are more useful than others. So I'll close with things like that. Okay, so I hope that makes sense to everybody. So here's my, my claim. And my claim is that it's fruitful for us to consider combinations of something I'm calling risk and uncertainty. I'm defining this riskiness, if I think of this, in terms of the degree of variation, limited variation versus extreme variation, if I think of the things that are certain with limited variation, you could imagine some sort of Gaussian distribution where I know what the limits of the probability distribution are, and I can have a very tight understanding of the expected outcomes. If I move to the sort of extreme variation, one of the things that's always confused me about Knightian uncertainty is thinking about, there's the extreme lack of information if I had a uniform distribution with infinite bounds. And so I'm going to think about risk in terms of that level of dispersion. That's the way I'm thinking of it as of this last week. On the what I'll call uncertainty dimension, I'll start the same, but I'll have like this Gaussian distribution, but then think through these notions of I have boom and bust distributions, so I have multiple ambiguous distributions about what future I'm going to be in, and conceivably, at least I could conceive that could be an infinite number of integrals. There's an infinite number of spaces. So at least I have some notation to help me think through that. And I think that there's some reasonable, plausible, and that's about as strong as I want to go, reasons to think that those two dimensions might help us describe and help us understand the theories and frameworks we're putting together. So, from a practical matter, you could imagine a new product that's coming together, and there might be some estimable risks, as well as some things that are deeply uncertain in a sort of Knightian way. And here I'm saying, okay, maybe I know more about cost overruns on a particular plant, but there's uncertainties about consumer acceptance as a product got more radical, and I might think of those on the uncertainty dimension. And can I plot myself in some sort of space? And I think that has implications for the tools we'd use. And so here I'm just saying, again, you could imagine tools for risk reduction and how they might vary, insurance, diversification, et cetera, how they might vary from the tools we would use for uncertainty management, whether it's effectuation or adaptation in shaping behaviors or not. So I'm trying to find a way for me to be consistent in thinking about these things. My short story about, to me, the strategy adjective should be useful. So are there, one way to think about this is some sort of canonical problems. Why do firms differ? Straight from the Fundamental Issues book that's been referenced. Are there tensions? Should I make or buy a product? Should I do something? I see Teppo and Todd in my side view, well, in an open or closed fashion from an article years ago. Should I be thinking about decision attributes, commitment and uncertainty, or I see Eric in the back, durability of a decision-making point? Are there particular tools that we can lay some claim to these frameworks or tools are more distinctive about our field than others? So that's how I'm trying to characterize the strategy space. And then I'm trying to think through some of, sort of the interesting things. So again, I'm going to emphasize the work with Hart and John. We haven't talked about Knightian uncertainty, but our whole conversation started with my recollection. Hart's is different. My recollection was, and I'm right. There was a conversation. We were in a panel on sequential decision making under uncertainty. We were both talking about risk in the terms of this discussion today, but I was talking about something like volatility, prospective uncertainty. He was talking about noise, which you might think about more in terms of this Knightian uncertainty, ambiguity types of sense. And we had very different mechanisms and frameworks. And we brainstormed ways to build models to help us incorporate both forms of unknowingness. And I think generated some interesting insights that's at least gotten some other folks interested. The most maybe relevant for strategy is an unpublished model where we can talk about how behavioral aspects might lead to competitive advantage. So we noted under these, so if there is this combination in that uncertainty regime slide of risk and noise, or prospective uncertainty and optionality and noise, we can start expecting decision-making errors. We can have room for bias in individuals or in teams or organizations where information is imperfectly filtered. And those errors are going to be, they're going to be costly errors, but some will be less costly than others. So if we believe we're in an environment where there's some sort of option value, over-optimism is going to be less costly than, sort of under-optimism, if you will, or under-confidence, if you will. So what we've been trying to do, I'm trying to think about is, can I take that logic and apply it to this notion of Knightian uncertainty and risk? There's some other, this sort of second bullet here is representing Sophocles, Eilano, and Lenos Trigorgis. So Lenos, as you may know, is very active in the real options space. And we looked at different measures or different dependent variables and how we could separate out different theories under these different spaces. So again, in that paper we were talking about different notions of dispersion. But again, the same logic for today. Can we use the space and the uncertainty regimes to inform and test some of our various theories that might be more tightly tied to one another? And then, the final bullet is meant to be my reminder to talk about, a bunch of work with Jeff and Todd on strategic choices with Sykot and Jeff on how strategic approaches differ and the value of different approaches are perceived to be valuable amongst academics and practitioners. And Tammy and I have a separate project thinking about how we even disagree about what we would consider strategic facts in our literature. And there seems to be some disagreement about that. So my approach is guided by that. So I'm going to very quickly come back to this and so go through 4 research questions. I've depicted, I'm going to go through very quickly 4 research questions because they're just research questions. It's fine. So I have that space. All I've done is add value to this. What I'm basically saying with research question 1 is, can we identify whether value creation, value capture, some other dependent variable that we care about varies across the uncertainty regime? And I'm listing some arguments to suggest high risk might lead to more value, to high uncertainty might lead to more value. I don't know of any work that's compared where we are and which of those approaches as well, and what happens when we have both high risk and high uncertainty. If I think of research question 2, there's a bunch of work. I referenced Hugh's impactful paper, and we could think about the types of tools that we might use. And we've typically thought about that on a single continuum. What happens when we put those on my notion of uncertainty regimes? So do we see day-to-day managerial services and traditional tools valuable in this certain and limited variation context? Do we see different kinds of tools, diversification, real options, portfolio thinking active in the high-risk setting? Or do we see other tools like effectuation, shaping, adapting, resource-based logic in the high uncertainty situation? If I think about research question 3, I referenced this a few minutes ago. We have a bunch of approaches that we've claimed are strategic. 84, I think in Pankaj's 2016 article, if I counted correctly, it gets up to 108. Can we use policy capturing methods to identify which of these approaches are more salient or more valuable in different spaces on the regime a bit? Can we separate between dynamic and static tools, dynamic and traditional tools, as Pankaj has done, and determine whether the dynamic tools are more effective in high uncertainty situations? And, there was discussion earlier today about process. So I think there's opportunities to use something like uncertainty regimes to think about system 1 and system 2, or of any variety of more deliberate or more maybe stakeholder-driven approaches. So I contrast in the footnote here Barbara Minto's excellent book on structured decision-making versus maybe Kenichi Omei's sort of more open approach to decision-making. Can we better assess which of these procedural approaches are effective as we move around the uncertainty regimes outlined in the prior slides? So I hope that's useful for speculation, maybe helps address some of the confusion, maybe you buy some of the claims, maybe this is a promise to help us revisit some of the classic ideas that have been developed in the strategy field. Thank you.
Green arrow. Yes. Move on. Okay. Okay, so thank you very much, and thank you, of course, to the organizers and to Nikolai for putting up, I think, this very interesting session. So we decided to stand, so I cannot take my piece of paper, the microphone, and the clicker, so I'll have to improvise on a few things, but that's fine. So the question, is strategic management useful under 19 uncertainty? I think that both Nikolai and Michael already answered yes. Let me give you my approach. It's, of course, yes, and it is nice to have a map, to have a theory, to navigate this 19 uncertainty. I'm being very careful with my terminology here. I'm not claiming it is necessary to have a theory. I'm not claiming it is sufficient to have a theory. It's nice to have a theory, okay? So I am sufficiently compromising here, and I think it helps, and we'll see in which ways. I think the way I would like to navigate you on what, and when I say we, I really mean we. I mean Arnaldo, I mean Andrea Pignataro, I mean Todd, I mean Teppo, a bunch of people with whom we have discussed these kind of things. Of course, they are not responsible for what I am saying, so blame me. If there is anything interesting instead, applaud them. But this is really a broad reflection. I would like to navigate this with you with an example. And I'd like to use, I could have used the example of Edison. This would have been a great example. I chose instead of using the example of this gentleman here, who is Leonardo Del Vecchio. He's an Italian famous entrepreneur. Arnaldo knows the company very well. Essentially, Del Vecchio had a vision in the 1970s. So he thought of something that was very obvious to us today, but not obvious in the 1970s. He said, glasses, spectacles, are not just an item for correcting eyesight defect. They can be a fashion item. I was alive in the 1970s, and I remember that. I was in high school, and no one had ever thought about this idea. In a couple of years, everyone had fashion glasses of all sorts. So he really envisioned a different world. And following really what I think Arnaldo said, he had an elaborate theory, which we can summarize with what you see here. He basically said, if I can make a good design, this market will exist. So what was his theory? And here is, we struggled a lot with this notion of theory. We asked economists, psychologists, computer scientists, strategy scholars, epistemologists. We think that the most parsimonious way of thinking about theories was given to us by decision scientists. They said, what is a theory? It's a restriction on the family of probability distributions you can create on a space. Essentially, they say, this is a theory. Probability of high demand for fashion glasses, conditional on making a good design, is greater than the probability of high demand for fashion glasses, conditional of not being able to produce a good design. Essentially, this inequality says not all probabilities are possible. Now, you may disagree. We find it super parsimonious and effective for reasons that we are going to discuss. Actually, this inequality raises three big questions. Question number one, what are these probabilities? This is the simplest question. Question number two, a little bit more difficult, which is this inequality true? Question number three, which is the most difficult of all, are we solving the right problem? Which basically boils down to, is it useful to think in this way? And I am trying in the next 3 slides to navigate these 3 questions with you. The simple question is called risk. Suppose that Del Vecchio thought in this way, it is a necessary and sufficient condition. What does this really mean? It means that he says, probability of high demand given yes is equal to 1. Probability of high demand given no is equal to 0. So this is the simplest way of building a theory in which you are pretty confident about what we are talking about. Well, the second question is if you start doubting, is it really pH given y 1? Maybe it's smaller than 1. And maybe pH given n, it's actually greater than 1. this simple statement is actually quite profound. It basically says, number one, compared to the previous cases, there may be other factors that could generate demand for fashion glasses. Issue number two, there could be situations in which even if I'm able to produce a good design, I will not be able to succeed. So this actually brings to the notion, this Del Vecchio under ambiguity starts thinking in terms of null hypothesis. Maybe I am wrong. So if you start thinking in terms of null hypothesis, you reason in a different way. Because in the previous case, you said, if I'm able to produce a good design, I am done. Now you say, if I'm able to produce a good design, I will succeed if my theory is correct. But if I'm able to produce a good design and my theory is wrong, I'm not going to succeed. So this Del Vecchio introduces the notion of beliefs. Do I believe that my theory is true or not? So his actually probability of success is no longer the probability of high demand of the previous case, but it's a weighted average. The belief of the probability of success under the theory plus the probability of success under any other possible theories that I'm not considering now. There is a third possibility, the real uncertainty. The question that Del Vecchio asks is, am I solving the right problem? Maybe the right problem is not whether I have a good design to produce high demand for fashion glasses. Maybe I should be very concerned because eye surgery is popping up and it's going to destroy my traditional market. Maybe I should think about a completely different state space. And he's a juggler, he's completely uncertain. He does not know what to do. So in this case, he has to create a notion of what is the probability of this meta space, which is the idea of plausibilities. Violina is going to talk about that, and so on and so forth. So let me tell you that these things are not just a general manifestation or discussions among a bunch of people between Utah and Milan and so on and so forth, but it's actually real. Let me give you 3 examples of CEO successions. General Electric, 2018, disaster, big debt, super diversified. The board had very clear ideas. We need to sell and focus. We need to have perfect execution. This will lower debt, necessary and sufficient. They hired Larry Culp because Larry Culp had records to solve this problem. State space, completely known. Probabilities, completely known. Bayer, German chemical company. They had this idea, we need to penetrate the US market. They have a clear setup of the problem. We need to produce new drugs. We need to buy a big company in the US to penetrate, Monsanto. They do that. They buy Monsanto for $69 billion, enter the US market, but there is something they did not consider. In the US, unlike Germany, customers complain, and they sue you. So after 2 years, it was unclear whether the benefits of Monsanto were actually worth the plaintiff's cost. They hire Bill Anderson, former CEO of Genentech, basically to test this hypothesis. Probability of success conditional on keeping Monsanto, is it equal or superior than the probability of success getting rid of Monsanto? This is a problem of ambiguity. If you read the very beautiful announcement that Akio Toyoda did in January 2023, this was, he's the grandson of the Toyota who founded the Toyota Motor Company. He basically said, we are the leader worldwide in hybrid vehicles, but maybe we should solve a different problem, move to electrical vehicles. He was considering these different problems. He had ideas, he had different theories, and he tried to succeed. So, let me give you something, and if I have time, how much time do I have? 5 minutes, so I can try to make it. What I'd like to show you is 2 videos. So essentially, we try to pick these theories, this framework, and put it in some actual tools. So what I'm going to show you is two videos. One is 2.0. No, the other one. Actually, you should go to the other video. Super. OK. This is a video in which an AI generator from a text will produce the Bayesian network, the probabilities, and you will see how many properties these things are. I call this behavioral AI. We need to understand what the computer does. So here we fed the computer with text, and this is generating the causal structure. Now, we can do more. We can add and eliminate attributes. And essentially, we can rebuild. We can react. Teppo has a very beautiful paper on how AI must be enhanced by the abilities of humans. Then, most interesting, suppose I take away part of the text. What do you think will happen? Well, most interestingly, you will see in a second, the network becomes more confused. If you feed AI with less information, it creates a more confused theory because it doesn't have enough information to create a nice structure. So then it generates probabilities. The two videos should sum up to 5 minutes, so I think I will have. And so it generates, just to give you a sense, we fed this tool with all our papers. Papers by Teppo, by Todd, by Arnaldo, by myself, and so on and so forth. And we asked, based on these papers, develop some theories. Then we asked them to produce beliefs, probabilities, and run experiments. Because, of course, at this point, you want to run experiments. And when you run the experiments, the tool will actually produce probabilities, and you can test. You can say, OK, what do we do here? There is a case up to, say, 2019. And we ask, make all the information using the information up to 2019. When you run the experiment, we ask the language model to use all the information after 2019 and see what happens, and it actually produces different probabilities and different stuff. This is really to tell you that these AI tools can actually be fed by theories, and they can actually be fed by models which you can develop theories. And then you have something in which it shows whether you are doing the right stuff or not. The other thing I want to show you super quickly, it's the other video. The next video is one in which the language model generates the theories for you. And again, this is, we call it Aristoteles. The language model, you ask a question. In this particular case, we ask a question about Google. What is the name of the decision maker? Sundar Pichai. Do you want to do a current challenge or historical decision? We do a current challenge. 2024, we ask the $100 billion questions, which is how can Google cope with antitrust regulation? How can Google and this is going to produce, also, do you have a theory of value? No. Of course. How many theories you can generate? 3. And this will actually generate 3 theories. And we have actually checked the tool. It actually generates fairly plausible theories, which actually make quite some sense. And they also generate probabilities with the theories. The theories, they generate the causal map. And now we don't have time to go into this, but it does actually produce theories that make sense. And what you can do is that you can compare and so on. You can stop the video and go to the last slide. So all this is, you can stop it, yes. Go just to the last, well, okay, I can, one more. So just really to conclude, what did we learn? We learned that there is a field here, which is called behavioral AI. We do not know how these language models respond. And so one thing that we learned, for example, less information, more confused networks. But they provide you with more orthogonal attributes. They're much more precise in the causes that they generate. Selection, relatively more important than generation. If these tools actually become powerful in generating theories, the key contribution, relatively speaking, of the CEO might become the ability to select the right theory as opposed to generate. What was the big constraint that entrepreneurs have? How many good ideas you can have? Well, maybe this is no longer a constraint. Maybe the constraint actually becomes which idea should I generate out of this. But, and this is, Teppo has a great paper on this. We experimented in this very, very small world. We don't think that AI can make it without assistance. And basically, there is an article just came out on Nature, which is essentially saying this, that if you keep feeding these models with their own data, they actually crash. So our answer to the question, can we make it with strategic uncertainty? Yes, if you have theories. Even more so, if you find the right way to interact with AI tools. Let me say that this would not have been possible. These are PhDs in management. These are students who actually faced the question, how can we actually learn something that it's not part of our domain? They learned, and they actually became really the people who programmed this. So thank you very much.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Still, thank you for being here to make this really special event. Thank you to Jay and Todd for imagining and creating this very special event. Thank you to Nikolai for convening our panel, and to my fellow panelists that they answered the question from the panel, so now I'm free. I particularly appreciate that they established the utility of strategy under 19 uncertainty so that I can focus on the possibility. So my talk will be very much focused in thinking about 19 uncertainty and some of the things that may not be happening right now, kind of in terms of how strategy works, but that could be happening if we turn attention to them. So I'm going to also, before I start, express my gratitude to several people who really, without whom I wouldn't be standing here today talking on this topic. One is my co-author, Hugh Courtney, with whom we were colleagues at University of Maryland in the early 2000s. Hugh, prior to taking the position as a teaching professor at Maryland, was actually the head of global strategy at McKinsey, and have spent a lot of time working on uncertainty, especially from a real options perspective. I arrived from Seattle, where I was studying Amazon when it was a 3-year-old startup, as well as Yahoo. And especially the initial race between the original search engines, if we remember the names. So what I learned from that experience, from those two cases, is that they actually took two very different strategies under uncertainty: adapting and shaping. I think you can guess who was who in that scenario. And so Hugh and I had a lot of conversations about uncertainty over the years. And the next event that really kind of got us together was the really exceptional conference that Sharon Alvarez hosted in relation to the special issue, where sort of I saw a possibility of actually having really a new perspective on thinking about uncertainty by looking more closely at the work of Knight. And the third person was our superbly insightful editor, Joe Porak, who actually really ensured that we took a deep dive in Knight's work. So with this as a background, the prompt for today's talk actually happened a little later. Recently, I was working with a senior leadership team of a global retailer that was pondering the future of retail. And they were working on the board essentially on the topics that they're going to bring back to the executive board to sort of start thinking about how that will affect their strategy. And about number 3 on their list of things was, how do we know? And I was like, wow, I would think sort of like philosophy of science, epistemology, but this like senior leadership team putting this as one of their top items on the agenda made me think that might be helpful to think about the relevance of strategy from the perspective of the relationship between knowledge and uncertainty, which brings us to the conversation that's focused on Knight. I'm not an expert on Knight. I'm going to borrow Senzi's comment that a lot has been written on this topic and a lot more will be written because uncertainty is pervasive. But what I would like to do is share my personal reflection on some of Knight's ideas about knowledge, and then maybe go from there and provide some ideas about the cognitive and conative capacities that underlie agency under uncertainty. So this is probably the most used quote from Knight. Essentially goes with the point that uncertainty is what uncertainty does, and what he said is that the essence of the situation is action according to an opinion of greater or lesser value, neither sort of complete ignorance, nor perfect information, but partial knowledge. The second part actually of the quote is what I have been focusing on, which is that if we are to understand the working of the economic system, we need to think about, to examine the meaning and significance of uncertainty. And to this end, some inquiry into the nature of knowledge and function of knowledge is important. And this is really kind of the idea that I want to bring forward in this conversation is the kind of how do we think in strategic management about the nature and function of knowledge in an environment where lack of information deteriorates outcomes and where there are many different models, the fit of which we don't fully understand. So going further, kind of working from Knight's ideas, he pretty much said knowledge is constructed, right? And that's probably not a revelation or insight in this room, but he was actually very specific in how he thought about the construction of knowledge. One was that knowledge is constructed in a temporal sense-making process, if you wish. It is constructed by connecting past, present, and future because we know the absent from the present, and we kind of imagine a future situation from kind of assuming what is valid from the past. And he actually has multiple quotes throughout the book where he emphasizes that the problem is that sort of rests in the future, but the solution comes from the past. So he was attentive to the temporal aspect of sense-making in thinking about Knightian uncertainty, or uncertainty at the time. Then knowledge is for the future. So this forward-looking perspective, with which we started the session today, was very, in Knight's terms, essentially part of consciousness itself. And knowledge is for action, which is that what is of interest to strategists and entrepreneurs is not knowledge for knowledge's sake, but how knowledge enables action. So that's kind of some basic ideas about knowledge. He also had really impressively sophisticated thinking about cognitive representations and creative and intentional acts. Similar ideas could be found in Leventhal, 2011, with the initial problem representations are really choices, right? Not necessarily capture objective situation, but reflect a set of possibilities. And Knight went further to argue that because we cannot make an exhaustive classification of things, reality is complex, and we actually don't really have ready categories for much of what produces that type of uncertainty, then we are creating these dynamic and fluid representations sometimes on the basis of one property, sometimes on the basis of another property, right? So there is this perspectival notion of which this perspective-dependent representation, right, the duck-rabbit illustration captures this very notion that perception is actually interpretive, right? That there is an element of interpretation. So when we think about uncertainty from those perspectives, then the selection of this process, the interpretive process, really precedes all other processes, and in particular, kind of for the purposes of the conversation we're having today, to get to the decision-making part, we really have to kind of traverse the interpretive path of figuring out what really are the relevant elements of the situation. What is relevant? What is in and what is out? We heard that conversation in the context of stakeholder theory. And what are our priorities? What is figure and what is background? So this is really kind of sense-making in a very classical sense, that essentially, in Knight's words, he basically said this problem prioritizes the subjective representations, right? They're inherently subjective nature. All right, so if this is the case, to Michael's point about confusion, is Knightian uncertainty a hall of mirrors, right? Where the representations are really not reliable. And this visual there illustrates that this object actually changes its shape in its reflection in the mirror, right? So the interpretive process might actually really transform the situation that strategist is working on. So if Knightian uncertainty is an epistemic obstacle to action, along the lines that I summarized here, then what supports action, right? How can strategists move forward in the face of Knightian uncertainty? And not just to take action, but even a higher order, right? To develop strategies which are integrated set of choices. So our answer, this was from the paper with Hugh, is that Knightian uncertainty calls for, it requires, and it enables agency. The very fact that knowledge is in a sense unreliable, given what is going on externally, this provides strategists with degrees of freedom. And they have degrees of freedom for the selection of both ends, values, right? What are valued goals, judgments of value, and means. So it really opens up a space of creative strategizing and thinking through the strategic situation from a perspective that is very different, that kind of a status quo situation really anchors cognition, as we all know very well. So the less defined the knowledge frameworks that are applicable in a given context, the more agency strategists have in developing them. So with that sort of thought about agency, I took a further step into looking into how actually Knight talked about knowledge. And it turns out that he wrote extensively on the topic of knowledge and really emphasized that knowledge is for action. And agency gives actors the ability to explore, not just to reduce the uncertainty in this situation, but to engage in exploratory behaviors. He also emphasized that relevant knowledge actually is not just the technical analysis of the situation, kind of your best understanding of what is going here, but also self-knowledge. And knowledge, social knowledge, knowledge of others. So here are two quotes from a paper he published in the Journal of Political Economy that speak to this. The subject matter of relevant knowledge, the relevant knowledge of conduct, in contrast to a mechanical response, sort of an underlying causal mechanism that you can reliably ascertain, is primarily human interests. Human interest in action and the relationship between the two. So that's the kind of understanding of knowledge that goes beyond the situation and its technical characteristics. But anything that can properly be called knowledge on the part of the subject is unthinkable apart from self-knowledge and valid intercommunication with similar, competent, and trustworthy knowing selves. living, thinking, and acting essentially in the same reality. I have to say this standard about competent and trustworthy others maybe poses a question to what extent knowledge is possible in this day and age. But apart from that larger conversation, what this points to is a theory of mind, right? That he actually really thought about action under uncertainty as having very strong social aspects, both sort of in the allocentric sense that Adam would talk about, but also sort of in an empathetic sense and the relational type of interactions that we heard in the stakeholder panel. So, specifically to the context of uncertainty, how many minutes do I have? 4. Okay, 5. That was really generous. So specifically to the context of uncertainty, he emphasized 2 pieces. I'd love to take you through these 7 points, but that's not going to happen. So the main idea which came out of this is that essentially these 5 variables where he explains how people vary under uncertainty is that they can be reduced to 2. The subjective confidence is in one's own judgment, about which many people have already written, and the conative attitude. And at this point, if you're wondering what conative attitude means, I was wondering too when I first encountered that. It turns out that conation at one point was actually part of the core thinking about human behavior: cognition, emotion, and conation. And conation kind of got dropped along the way, and I'll say a few words about that. What Knight said about conation is that sort of some people prefer uncertainty, and some people want nothing to do with it. And this preference for uncertainty actually, albeit people are studying it as a part of agency, and in particular the notion of expansive agency. All right, I have to get to the core of my talk, which is really about thinking about the cognitive and conative capacities through which agency under uncertainty can be activated. So I clearly am not going to have time to elaborate on all of them, so I'm going to summarize them here. The conative attitude, conation, has to do with will. The will to act, the will to take on uncertainty, the resolve to persevere, the contribution of sustained intellectual and otherwise energy, commitment essentially to action. So that's different from motivation, which is about expectation and interest, right? It's kind of some sense of a notion that I'm in. And there are really kind of under uncertainty 2 types: unknowingness, doubt, and opportunity. Hugh and I wrote about this very part in our paper in terms of what that means for developing, adapting versus shaping strategy. Next, it's temporal cognition. This is where I started. How people think about the past, present, and future, and how they connect the past, present, and future has significant impact on how they imagine, ideate, and define possibilities. All right, we're going to skip through the cool pictures in which Mercedes is reinventing of the future of mobility. Maybe I'll just show this one, where they're actually showing how they're using their original model to reinvent autonomous driving. So that's sort of mental time travel as temporal cognition. Epistemic stance is the cognitive relationship that strategists can adopt toward the environment to understand it or to create it, right, to essentially redesign it. And how they do this depends on their imaginative capacities. There are many different imagination processes that have been identified, but sort of from a strategy point of view, I think an important distinction is the distinction that goes back to Kant, which is the difference between productive and creative imagination. And there is more on a paper that's under review in Strategy Science, so stay tuned. The final bit of thinking about cognitive and conative capacities and agency under uncertainty is really work that already has begun in strategy, which is on regulatory focus. And what is really fascinating about regulatory focus, that these are behavioral patterns, conative patterns, that have been actually found to make particular difference under uncertainty because of the different ways in which regulatory focus affects thinking, in terms of milestones versus set sequences, which requires a lot more information in detail. So, in sum, what is distinctive about the agency perspective? Knightian uncertainty requires and enables agency. Agency rests on cognitive and cognitive capacities, right? There is that aspect of action that cannot be kind of explained outside just on the basis of cognition. Agency goes beyond decision making. It's actually reality making, right? There is a lot of creative component in this. And a human agency approach to strategy making actually is consistent with the notion of strategy as a subjective activity under uncertainty, which Knight was very emphatic about. Let me just finish here with here's some strategy context where, in the spirit of provocation, I have argued that it may be necessary to have a component of agency. One is the topic of today, uncertainty, both for the purposes of adapting, the flexibility, and for the purposes of shaping, which is imagining visionary strategies. Developing novel strategies, escapes from the status quo, which has been kind of a core problem in thinking about novel and distinctive strategies. Addressing societal grand challenges and ethics and cultural demands on companies is a personal agentic approach, capitalizing on emerging trends and increasing stakeholder engagement. Hopefully, we have time for a lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Violina. It appears we have only 20 minutes left, but on the other hand, it's late in the afternoon, and Knightian uncertainty is such a simple concept, so probably 20 minutes should suffice, shouldn't it? Any comments, questions? Oh, number. Okay. Let's do Dick for it. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Dick Langlois from the University of Connecticut, and I'm here under false pretenses because I don't teach strategy or management. But I did write about Knightian uncertainty a long time ago. Recently I got talked into writing about Knight again, and so got to think about Knight again. And I want to make three very quick observations from my rethinking of Knight. One is that I think in some ways Knightian uncertainty and all the probability stuff is a little bit of a red herring, in that he was talking about all that stuff not because he wanted you to figure out how to solve probability, but because he was really making the argument that Herbert Simon would make in 1960, namely that humans have cognitive comparative advantage in judgment. And so Nikolai and Peter have written a lot about that. What does that mean? And somebody like David Autor, if you know the work of David Autor has picked up on this and said, well, look, there are some tasks that are inherently suited to human cognition, and there's some tasks that are inherently mechanical and suited to mechanical cognition, and we should assign the human tasks to the humans and the mechanical tasks to machines, and we'll probably talk about that tomorrow in the context of in the context of AI, but one of those human tasks surely is management, right? And so one way, speaking as an outsider, you could reconceptualize strategy is that strategy is about helping people who are managers make judgments. And Knight, in fact, talked a lot about that. He talked about the ways in which information could be used to make judgments, as opposed to what? As opposed to conceptualizing strategy in the way it traditionally was for most of the 20th century as rational decision making. I come out of a decision analysis background, and that's the way I started thinking about it. This is, I think, a very different way to think about it. And one last remark I just want to throw out there for discussion, and that is to come back to a point that I think somebody made earlier today, I don't remember who, in a very different context, and that is the perspective from Knightian uncertainty is very different from the perspective from evolutionary theory. So Knight, we have to remember, was a theorist of perfect competition. The whole first half, or first two-thirds of the book was about perfect competition. And so his story was, well, let's start with a world where everybody knows everything about everything, which is a little bit hard to imagine, but and then let's relax that assumption. And so that's kind of what he's doing, and you get to a place that's more like the real world in some place because we've relaxed that assumption. But the other way you could start is we don't know anything at all, right? So think about something like Armin Alchin's famous 1950 paper about evolution. We don't know anything. We're ignorant agents, and then we learn things. And I submit, and you can all discuss this, I submit you get to a very different place if you start with people not knowing anything and then learning stuff, rather than assuming they ought to know everything and you have to relax the assumption and let them be ignorant about some things.
Okay, let me get a total left field view here. Listening to the first two talks, I was reminded a little bit of Monsieur Jourdain in Molière's Bourgeois Gentilhomme. He's the fellow who has been taught about poetry and about prose, and he shouts happily, "I have been speaking prose my entire life." And to some extent, I'm wondering whether part of this isn't that we are seeing something that we kind of know, right? So the environments that you described, the dynamics of agency that Julina described, are kind of the things that even those of us who look at contemporary strategy environments are bread and butter, right? And they are documented. People like Kathy and her students have documented it in a number of technology settings. It's kind of the world. It's not strange and new. So I'm wondering not about it if you're interested in the epistemology of understanding, and Dick just gave us an interesting sort of meta-thought, if you care about the world and what is your mental gymnastic of understanding probability, but for strategy. And the question is, how does that matter? And here's where I'm really puzzled. When Alfonso presents what I absolutely love, and that's the way we should be teaching strategy. But you're speaking about something that has AI. What does AI do? It does not give a damn about probabilities. It does not give a damn about night. It says, I'm going to have an algorithm figuring out which way is up. Period. It's computational statistics. All forms of it are computational statistics. Forget night, he's irrelevant. Forget probability distributions, they are irrelevant. What you are giving us is orthogonal to night, because it has nothing to do with probabilities. It's just, I figure stuff out. So I'm trying to reconcile the two. And the question that I have for you is not, hey, we care about night, or we care about uncertainty, we care about this because we're scientists. What does that have to do to teach us something new about the world? How should we change our understanding, especially if you think that, if you look at AI and Gen AI, it doesn't care about night, it works in a different way.
Very worthy question indeed. Perhaps we should let our panelists respond to Michael's provocation.
Okay. Can you hear me? That is a very interesting provocation. My understanding of Alfonso's talk is that actually human agency made a big difference in implementing the process. So having tools and how we use these tools is a problem that's not just in strategy, but in all of life. Where I think Knight, the reason why it's valuable to draw on Knight is that in developing his ideas about uncertainty as a knowledge problem, he actually opens a different way of thinking about strategy under uncertainty in terms of how you go about developing knowledge. There are many different ways of developing knowledge, one of which is through AI, and many others are actually maybe on the poetic versus prose side. In your example, our field has done relatively little with the employment of imaginative capacities to really develop strategies about what could be, not what is, and what could be from a human perspective that incorporates values because we actually care. So Knight spends a lot of time talking about why it matters that we care, and how human desires are a path to the exercise of freedom. So when I look at Knight, I actually see a possibility for having a conversation of how we can be more agentic in the face of a very powerful technology that can do a lot of the cognitive stuff to which we have historically tied notions of agency.
Go ahead, Michael, if you want. So just super, thanks, Violina, because she saved, I think, 80% of what I wanted to say. So let me just focus on the remaining 20%. So I was actually educated and trained also by my family to always think that there is nothing yes or no. Okay, so probabilities, I am of this opinion that they're useful in some contexts. They're not always useful. So I think that we should really understand when they are useful and when they are not useful. In the particular case that we are developing here, I think, and I'm saying it very modestly, the novelty I learned personally, maybe this is something obvious to everyone, is that if you feed AI with a model, our papers, and we tell them, this is the notion of probability, use this concept to illuminate me on what's going on, this is the response. I was thinking Jasper Sorensen notion of analogies. If we fed them with their papers, maybe the answer would have been completely different. Maybe it would have been substantially a similar answer, but using a different representation of the world. So I think this is the way I have learned about this tool. But the most important thing is we have to have a model to feed that. Otherwise, this is going to be completely useless.
Scott Stern from MIT. So first, I wanted to thank both the panelists and the I guess, moderator for what I thought was an enormously productive discussion about Knightian uncertainty by, I think, putting, except for maybe Alfonso's last point, the question of, is there no probability distribution you can find, a little bit to the side. And what I mean by that is I'm going to go back to, I thought, Michael, and we can sort of double click on it maybe informally, this notion that risk and uncertainty are different. And that it's useful to reason about the ways in which they're different is enormously productive. Risk should be shared understanding of, if I have a coin, most of us here would say it has a 50% chance one way or the other. That's very different than if I have a business idea, which Alfonso thinks is the best idea in the world, and somebody else thinks is just terrible, right? Their perception, their subjective beliefs are different, and there's no, because of I think, Violina, your very nice description, I think, of the kind of epistemological, almost like theory of mind problems of adjudicating that difference, which we all have with our colleagues, at least, when somebody votes differently than you literally say, I can't imagine how they ended up in that position on, this tenure case or this decision or whatever it would be. A referee, too, stands in here for a lot, right? And so, what I'm trying to get at is I thought it was a very productive discussion by really thinking about the role of uncertainty versus risk, but also making it clear that we don't necessarily mean by uncertainty a kind of almost lazy, whoever could think about that. Do you see what I'm saying? But that it is instead that it comes closer to what Jan and some other, I think throughout the day we've heard, is that the essence of strategy is choice, but that choice is a process of generating strategic options and then choosing among them. That gives us agency. And that starts, and some of that we can do with the models that Alfonso, I'm not going to go on for too much longer, that Alfonso just talked about, but I think even more binds a tremendous amount of thinking about how you can create concrete tools for managers that they won't get from other disciplines by being able to focus on crystallized, important, commitment-oriented choices in which reasonable people can disagree about underlying probabilities.
Kathy Eisenhart from Stanford. Just a couple things. One is I wonder if this Knightian uncertainty is kind of hanging us up. I'm feeling like Knight is being treated almost biblically, like we have to read a passage and then interpret it. He's like 100 years ago. Can't we just call it uncertain? Can't we just call it ambiguity? Because I think that's mathematically what it is, and intellectually that's what it is. And sort of get away from having to be true to Knight unless we're feeling cult-like. So I might just go a little bit further from Knight than maybe others and just say there's ambiguity and there's uncertainty. And then risk is kind of the interesting one because actually that was my dissertation. And I always took risk as really something that's personal. So there's a probability of 50-50, but my risk may be different from, let's say, Scott's. So Scott's like, he's a going for it guy and and so that's where the risk is we see the same probability, but we choose differently because we have different risk orientations. So I think, to me, that's what risk is, and it's personal. It's not about the situation. And what else I was going to say? I love imagination. Bielina, I think that's your best stuff, Everett. I think it's really great. I'm looking forward to whatever it is you do with it. What other comment? I have no idea how AI can help with strategy. I was kind of with Michael on that, like, whatever. Let's see what happens. Maybe there's something there and maybe there's not. But who knows? I think it's fun to talk about, and Alfonso's always entertaining and provocative, and it was cool. But I don't know what's there. So in summary, my point is, let's drop the Knight thing. And kind of get on to what the really things are. And for example, what's a plus and a minus about a shaping strategy? For example, we know that under ambiguity, shaping is a smart strategy, but an even smarter strategy might be to wait and then follow the shaper and do better. So and Bielina knows this paper I've got on 23andMe versus Ancestry. 23andMe was the shaper, kind of is dying. Ancestry is the follower, adapted, and is the winner. So I think thinking about the pros and cons of shaping and adapting is, I think, maybe a more productive way for us to be thinking in the future.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so thanks for that session. Maybe it's just the afternoon. I'm not sure I understood all of it, but it was all very fascinating. Or I'm uncertain that I understood all of it. But anyway, the thing that struck me, though, was I was kind of, I was expecting maybe, I think it was very interesting, but I was expecting maybe a little bit more focus on commitment and irreversibility. And Scott just mentioned this and sort of, right? It's not just about choices, it's about irreversible choices. And the canonical problem, of course, being how do we make irreversible choices and get other people to make irreversible choices in a world where we're not even sure, right? And I think that gets into a lot of this. I really like the sort of, it's not just about adapting, it's actually about shaping notion, but I think that sort of gets into, do we commit to the shaping or do we, so I'd be curious to think about, and again, I think in Alfonso's thing, right, I don't know how I couldn't quite follow the AI, but I have to imagine the AI is also, it's not just the probability of something coming true, it's how reversible is your theory in some sense seems quite important. So I'm curious about how you think about that in this context.
Great, thank you. Great comments. It's really fun to see the different perspectives on what people heard. I'll go to the question of the irreversible commitment and shaping. I think this is actually an open field for research. It's one of those areas where, in my opening comments, I said it's where the possibilities for strategic management, and I think the work on shaping strategies is maybe a little past nascency, but kind of in, and I think we know very little actually about the actual processes of shaping, sort of the initial capabilities that may require and how this works. So that's a great area for discovery. Currently I'm working on a case study where we're looking at this company that actually started by sort of following a very systematic science-based approach to discovering opportunities and then switched to shaping. And it really has been amazing for me to see what shaping entailed in the case, starting from imagination, generalizing to a possibility, moving into kind of socializing potential clients to work with that, embedding the notion of possibility when the clients, going back from ad hoc projects to capabilities. It really is a whole other way of thinking about strategy. So I would say that that's an incredibly germane area to pursue, because I think we know more about adapting. There is a much longer tradition, and a lot of people in this room have written amazing stuff about it.
Just a few quick things. One, I would like to crystallize what Scott said. Scott said, and we did not coordinate on this. So Scott basically said, of course, we are going to disagree because we see the world in a different way. But what is important is that we agree to disagree. And this is the way you cope with night and uncertainty. Think about my 3 examples of my 3 CEOs. When the board decided what had to be done about General Electric, there was no disagreement. It was very clear. It was like tossing a coin. It's either head or tail. When Bayer was considering, should we keep Monsanto because of the benefits of penetrating the US, or should we sell it because of the harm of all these plaintiffs? They called someone who could collect the information to test this hypothesis. In Akio Toyoda's case, he was completely uncertain about what to do. But he specified the problem very well so that in the board, they could discuss. I agree with the hybrid, I agree with electric. I think this is the way to cope with night and uncertainty. On a quick thing about Kathy's AIs, I agree with you. We should... On the other hand, let's be careful. There are companies making huge investments in AI. 50 years ago, the finance industry was like strategy today. Today, the finance industry is AI. Architecture, my mother was an architect. She used to draw with pencil and things. Today, architecture is a completely different stuff. Maybe we should take this AI business a little seriously, at least to see what's going on.
And it turns out we have a whole panel on that question tomorrow. How convenient. Thank you. Thank you very much, panel. Okay, we have an hour break at 5:30. The buses will be leaving. Those of you who want to get a ride down to Silver Baron, there'll be some faculty with cars to meet you down in the lobby here shortly. And everyone else, we'll see you at 5:30. Any questions? Chili. It's a chance it might be chili.
Gentlemen, it has been a pleasure to play with you. This is really...
Bring a sweatshirt.
Cutting your sauce.